The Man in the Suit. Chapter 5. A few weeks after the success of Gojira, a rumor started spreading around the studio. Apparently, the executive producer of Toho had a welcome home party after coming back from a business trip. During the celebration, he instructed Tanaka to make a sequel immediately. On the morning of November 28th, Tanaka walked into the main soundstage looking anxious. He quickly pulled Honda aside and spoke with him. I was at the back of the building, packing up remaining props from the last movie, when I noticed. They talked for a few minutes and then Tanaka bowed to Honda and walked away. I rushed over to him and asked what was wrong. And Honda turned to look at me with a look of worry on his face. Tanaka has been tasked to make a sequel, when I told him I was unavailable for it. Honda had another movie to direct after Gojira. It was titled Love Tide. He clenched his teeth and continued. I need you to work cameras for it. Goji is going to need some company while filming. I blinked. Sorry, did you say Goji? I asked. Yeah, that's what the corporate decided to call our man in the suit. I thought it was pretty offensive too, but he's never told us his real name, so guess we'll stick with Goji. My heart sank. The brutal world of business now wanted the hopeless creature stored in the studio basement to star in yet another movie. And now we couldn't take no for an answer. I wanted to break away from the company, but decided it was for the best that Goji had a familiar face on set with him. I wasn't the only person to return for the sequel. Tanaka still produced the film, as well as Tsuburaya, who came back to help with special effects. Toshimitsu was the only designer of the suit to return. Watanabe reportedly was too traumatized to come back to the studio. This film was directed by Motoyoshi Oda, to replace Honda for his own film he was working on. Goji took interest in this as Oda was a big fan of the first movie, though he was never told of the incident. The day he found out was when we released Goji from his cell to take a look at the new set that was constructed. Oda laughed at first. Did you put him in the costume early? Because he looks so eager to destroy Osaka this time. No one else laughed. Then Tanaka broke the news to him privately. Oda was shocked, but decided to keep going because this was the Godzilla that we had now. Apparently the first movie hadn't been released in America yet, but Gojira now had an English name, Godzilla, and our sequel was given a unique name, Godzilla Raids Again. We all began to notice how Goji's appearance had changed drastically. He looked taller, much slimmer, and his teeth were jutting out even more than before. His bloodshot eyes had grown larger pupils to make him even more intimidating and focused. Toshimitsu was the first to point it out, and we decided to tell corporate that we just simply created a new suit design. When Goji came on set that morning, he was informed that he wouldn't be the only monster in this movie. Murata, who wrote the last movie, had written a new monster to challenge Godzilla in battle. He gave the monster the name Anguirus. They didn't show Goji his new opponent until a few days later, when Toshimitsu dragged out the new suit. It was designed to walk on all fours, had a hard-shelled back covered in semi-sharp spikes, a long tail that had 3 spikes on the tip, a long snout like a crocodile, several spikes on the nape of its neck, and a short horn on its nose. Goji stared at the empty suit for a minute, then looked back at Toshimitsu and started nodding his head in agreement. The new monster was now Goji approved. Filming began as usual. We filmed the scenes without the monsters first, such as 2 pilots stranded on a deserted island and scientists and politicians plotting to keep Godzilla away from the city of Osaka, which was a change from Tokyo. Then there were action shots of actors trapped by burning fuel tanks amidst the chaos of the fighting that would be shot later on. It was there that we moved back to the small soundstage with the pool to begin filming the first monster fight. This time, a large mountainous arena was built on top of the pool. An opening crevice on one side of the set led to a 7-foot drop off a cliff into the pool. The plan was to have the 2 monsters have a brawl in the arena, then push each other off the cliff. We set up our cameras and began rolling. Goji stared down at his opponent. Anguirus stared back. Goji then smacked his tail down on the set for intimidation. Anguirus charged at him, and the battle had begun. Anguirus got up on 2 of his hind legs and used his front 2 to claw at Goji, but he was pushed back, and then charged at Goji again. This time the two danced around as Goji threw a couple punches at Anguirus. They brawled it out for a few minutes before Anguirus' actor called a timeout. The cameras were cut and the actor took off the suit. He was drenched in sweat. The suit he was wearing was designed to be more lightweight so he could easily fight Godzilla, but it still got extremely hot inside of it. Goji didn't need any breaks, for now that the man inside grew into the shape of the suit, his strength grew with him, and he waited patiently as Anguirus' actor got some water and climbed back into the suit. We decided to move on to the scene where they fell into the sea. Crew members waited off camera to grab Anguirus and Goji out of the pool so they wouldn't drown. They mostly agreed to go for Anguirus because they were confident in Goji resurfacing on his own. Oda yelled, "Action!" and the fight continued. Goji started pushing Anguirus towards the cliff, but Anguirus held on. As both toppled over the cliff, my camera recording the splash followed the two beasts down as they landed with a massive sploosh. I kept recording for a couple more shots before we immediately cut. 3 men jumped in to find Anguirus, who still hadn't resurfaced. They crouched in the water desperately trying to feel for 2 large bodies. After a few seconds, they couldn't find him. Panic broke out as suddenly Oda, Tanaka, and I jumped in to help with the search. "They should still be right here," one of the crew members cried. "Is there a deeper spot we can't find?" another one asked. I kept crouching in the water trying to feel for them. Suddenly, there was movement several feet away from us. A large, dark body rose out of the water. It was Goji. In his arms, he was dragging Anguirus' actor with him, still in the suit. We all frantically ran over to them and helped Goji drag the lifeless body on the dry set. Once he was out of the water, crew members helped pull the actor out of the suit. He was unconscious. Goji stood back in shock. We could tell by his face. After they dragged Anguirus' actor out of the suit, he coughed and spat out water, struggling to get air. He was all right, and it took me until that moment to realize that Goji had saved his life. He apparently landed on Anguirus by accident, holding him under as later explained by the exhausted actor. It was so scary. I didn't think I was going to make it. I blacked out and next thing I knew I was being pulled out of the suit. We all looked at Goji, who looked pretty guilty. His snout was tightly closed as his eyebrows pointed up to a sad look, and his big eyes popped out like a dog. I walked over and spoke to him. "He's all right. You saved him. If it weren't for your quick thinking, he might have drowned." Goji looked at me with reassurance and then smiled. He pulled me into a tight bear hug. It felt so awkward at first, like running into a sports mascot as a child. But I found myself hugging back. The whole situation with Goji being just a guy whose body inflated into a suit may have been unnerving and scary, but we started to grow to love him. He was very cooperative with Anguirus' actor, and every take they did was flawlessly executed. We traditionally filmed shots of Gojira in slow motion, but then someone left one of the cameras running in a faster motion by accident. But Oda actually thought it looked unique, so we ended up filming the fight scenes in a faster motion for most of the wide shots of the fight. The scenes with Gojira destroying Tokyo may have looked exciting, but watching 2 monsters brawl it out was even more fun to watch. No one had ever seen that done on film, except for the original King Kong. Sometimes they would push each other into buildings. Other times one would trip on a house. They always worked well on choreographing their moves to make the fight look even more believable, even though Goji couldn't say any more than some growls and roars. We filmed these scenes for several weeks, and that's when we got up to a major scene with them fighting by the famous Osaka Castle. It was a beautiful replica, built to scale for the canonical size of the monsters, which was 50 meters in height. Every little detail looked perfect, and in my eyes standing next to it, I almost felt like Godzilla. But that morning things were different. Anguirus' actor was running late for the shoot, and Goji was always such a patient actor. But that morning he seemed anxious, like he was waiting for something bad to happen. But then again, we were still getting used to how Goji was able to express his emotions using a suit only designed to show one, the look of pure evil. But we all knew that Goji wasn't evil. He just portrayed a character that was evil in the eyes of society. But Goji was once a man. Now he was a walking beast who gave his heart to his role, which was a permanent one in that matter. As I tried to determine what was wrong, Anguirus' actor walked into the soundstage. I noticed a look on his face that looked rather familiar. He looked sweaty, and his eyes looked bright red and tears forming. just like the one day the man in the suit entered the soundstage 3 months earlier. It was January now, so getting allergies seemed unlikely, considering how cold it now was in Japan. The sweat also caught me off guard because it was around 40 degrees Fahrenheit outside that day. He didn't say a word, and immediately got into costume to start the shoot. He started walking dramatically in character towards the castle set. That's when I noticed Goji again. He stood up, and this time had a small grin on his face. He looked eager to start filming, I thought, so we got ready as quickly as possible. The plan for this scene was for Godzilla to push Anguirus into the castle, and the two of them would then fall into the sea. They would later end up on a snow-capped mountainous island where the final battle was set to take place. The cameras began rolling, and the two beasts continued their match. Goji had Anguirus in his grasp as he began to shove him into the castle. The set must have been built pretty good because he had to shove him twice more into the castle before it began to collapse. My camera was on the other side, ready to film their fall into the ocean. Anguirus and Goji fell with the castle, but then something went wrong. Terribly wrong. Instead of falling into the water, Goji kept Anguirus in his grasp and pulled him away from the water. He spun him around and threw him on the ground beside the castle onto dry land. The monster landed with a hard thud. Then Goji jumped behind Anguirus and cranked open his jaws. In one swift motion, he bit down hard on the neck of Anguirus' suit. Blood began to pour from the neck, and the actor inside the suit started to scream. We realized that his head was positioned in the neck of the suit, and Goji kept biting down hard until Anguirus went limp. I never stopped recording. My camera was fixed on a gruesome close-up of the carnage unfolding before our very eyes. All of the crew members were backed away from the set so the camera couldn't see them in the shot. They all began to rush over to the scene of the disaster. With my camera still rolling, Goji let go of Anguirus' neck, and the limp body dropped dead on the floor. Goji let out a horrifying growl. It wasn't the epic sound I heard when they were making Gojira. This sound was for real. It sounded like a massive bear warning everyone to back up. I stopped filming, and actually did back up. I backed into the mob of set designers and crew members as they all stopped in their tracks. We stared in silence at the body of Anguirus bleeding on the ground, and Goji standing his ground. No one moved. We just stared at both of the monsters in terror. Goji had this look of pride and intimidation on his face as his eyes grew wide, and his teeth shifted into an unnerving grin. He not once moved away from Anguirus, who we started to notice that he was moving. The body was twitching and shaking uncontrollably. The actor was just injured inside of the suit, but he was still bleeding all over the set. Crew members tried to approach him, but when they did, Goji swung his tail on the ground and let out a roar. He didn't want any of us to get near Anguirus. There were a couple more attempts by the crew to approach Anguirus, but they were always stopped by Goji's intimidation. It wasn't until a few minutes later when Anguirus started to lift himself up and slide towards us. Goji let him through. Anguirus limped his body over to us, and Toshimitsu tried to unzip the suit, but the zipper was stuck. He immediately noticed how even more stiff the suit was than before. It didn't take me more than a few seconds to realize what had happened. The actor inside the Anguirus suit had now become the suit. Chapter 6. The new body groaned and growled like an animal. Goji tried to walk over to Anguirus, but this time the crew member stopped him. His intimidating face now shifted to one of concern, like a child wondering if he had done something wrong. Toshimitsu bandaged up Anguirus' neck and immediately ordered crew members to take him away. Anguirus was then dragged away off the set. Oda, who had also witnessed the whole incident, glared at Goji. "Take him back to his cell," he ordered. And then several crew members grabbed him and escorted the guilty thing out of the building. I walked over to Oda. "Don't you think that's a little much?" I asked angrily. "A little much? A little much? Did you not just see what happened? Oda snapped. He injured a former castmate, and now he's become a monster just like him. I gave him a shove, and Oda stumbled back. Don't you call him a monster. He's still human deep down, and you know it. Oda balled up his fists, ready to fight, but then he relaxed them. He then proceeded to have a full-on breakdown, right there on set. Out of instinct, I squatted down and patted his back, attempting to calm him down. Through his sobs, he spoke softly. I signed on to this movie, thinking it would be a nice change, but I was afraid of ruining the first movie's reputation. Then when Tanaka told me that our star of the show was something out of Frankenstein, I just tried to go with it. Now I don't know if I can continue with two of them running around, he continued sobbing. I thought to myself how Oda wasn't there the first time this happened. Where 1 second he was human, and the next he's taken the form of the character in a horribly literal fashion. Oda had the right to be scared, for I still was. We had all become attached to Goji out of sympathy for his condition, but deep down, we were still all new to this. And now that it happened again, that fear began to show itself once more. Oda pulled himself together and slowly walked out of the soundstage, leaving the remaining crew to sit and process the event. We stood in silence. Over the last few months, we've had many moments like this, of just sitting in silence. It was always an unsettling silence, a tense silence, or a confusing silence. But this one was different. It was a silence of guilt. We all seemed to feel responsible for the incident, but we never were. I started thinking, why did he attack Anguirus? Why did he go off script? Why did he just stand and watch his partner bleed? None of it made sense. And then I remembered what I saw that morning. The state of the actor, the smoky eyes, the profuse sweating. That seemed like too much of a coincidence to be allergies. Then I remembered back to when the man in the suit looked the same way that one day, and how he became the suit a few days later. I started piecing it together. I remembered the drug capsule that fell out of his bag that day, and how the label looked like it had been ripped off. That's when it hit me like a punch in the gut. Both of the actors were drugged, and then they took the form of their suits, but it still didn't make any sense. Was there really a drug that inflated the human body? I didn't know. Hell, I didn't want to know. But if that was the case, then where were they getting it from? A dealer? An anonymous prescription? Or was it something far more sinister than that? With all of this flooding my brain, I decided that there was now one thing I had to do. Find out where this mystery drug came from. And there was only one person I could speak to. Oda gave me permission to go downstairs to see Goji in his cell. The hallway's gray paint looked more faded than the last time I was there, which was only 3 months ago. I walked over to the cell I knew Goji was in. Forgetting about the last time, I slid the window panel open, but there was no pair of eyes to greet me. Instead, the room was dark, but just bright enough for me to see a massive silhouette sitting in the center of the room with its back to the door. I stepped in and said, "Hey, it's me again." The shadow turned its head to me, and then I saw those eyes, those big, white, guilty eyes. Goji backed away from me, like he was scared. I leaned closer. "Don't worry, I'm not mad at you, but we are all very concerned." Goji turned to me again, and this time tilted his head. Then he let out a sad groan. I knew what he was asking. "He's doing fine," I continued. "He's a bit shaken up from your off-script act, but now is just like you." And at that comment, Goji turned away again, then this time slid into the corner of the room. His tail began to curl him up like a security blanket. He was regretting his decision, but I still didn't know what his intentions were. I sat there for a moment in that dark cell to think about what I was going to ask him, how he could possibly answer me. Then I had an idea. "I'll be right back," I told him, and ran out of the cell without even closing the door. I quickly ran back upstairs where I grabbed a pencil and a notepad on a writer's desk. I jumped back down the spiral staircase and rushed back into Goji's cell. He was still sitting in the corner, but this time his head was turned towards the door. I squatted down next to him and handed him the notepad and pencil. He stared at it for a moment, and then his eyes darted back up to me. He hesitantly grabbed them both and began to jot down something, recklessly. After several scribbles on the notepad, he handed it back to me. The handwriting was messy, but I could easily make out the words. "Can you read this?" I instantly knew that this was just a warm-up for proper communication, so I told him that I could read it just fine. He took the notepad back from me and started writing down something else. He handed it back to me. "I'm so sorry for hurting him, but I had to." I looked confused. "Why did you have to bite him?" I asked. He continued to write. "I had to make sure that it worked, or else none of you would know." I started to grow worried, but I was onto something. "Is this about the drugs you were taking? Did he have them too?" Goji's eyes grew. They looked filled with anger as he continued to write. "How do you know? Who told you? Was it him?" "Him? Who was him?" My common sense told me that he must have meant Toshimitsu. But then again, Goji got along well with him, so I didn't know. I emphasized to him. Toshimitsu never said a word about it. Goji shook his head as he kept writing. "Not Toshimitsu. Him." Anxiety began to rise in my blood. "What do you mean by him?" I asked. "Is he someone we know? Someone you met that I don't know? Who is he?" He began to jot down a name. Then suddenly we heard a sound outside in the hallway. Goji quickly tried to erase his notes, but then resorted to stuffing the notepad and pencil under his bed. I blocked the side of it as the door to the cell creaked open. It was Toshimitsu. He came in with a platter of food for Goji. Then he noticed me sitting in the room. "Did I walk in on something?" he asked. I hesitated, then came up with a partial lie. "We were just doing some therapy. Goji's just a bit shaken up from his outburst." Goji nodded in agreement, then covered his face with his hands like a child. Toshimitsu's eyes went back to Goji's. "Well, I just came in and wanted to tell you that Goji should really try to eat. You haven't really had something in the last few months." My blood ran cold. Then I glared at Goji. Then my eyes darted back to Toshimitsu. "What do you mean he hasn't eaten in months?" Toshimitsu stopped in place. Then he set the tray of food down on the bed. "Ever since the incident, he hasn't begged for any food, nor has he touched whatever we gave him. We figured it was just a sign of depression. But he's had so much energy during the shooting of this movie, it's like he doesn't need to eat at all." He looked back at Goji, who looked like he'd heard this before. "But today, you should really try and eat." Toshimitsu slid the platter his way, but Goji ignored it. He crossed his arms and turned away. His arm then waved at him like he was telling him, "Shoo, go away." Toshimitsu took the platter and began to walk away. "I'll just leave you two to continue with your therapy." And with that, he disappeared down the corridor. I looked back at Goji. Then I whispered to him, "How have you lived without food for so long?" Then he reached back to grab the notepad, then wrote down a simple phrase, "I don't need it." I looked back at him with suspicion. Whatever made him this way somehow made it to where he didn't need any type of energy and food to survive. I shook it off and trailed back to who he meant by him. Goji began to write something. I was expecting a name to come up, but it was just another summary. "He won't tell me. He came to see me outside of his studio when no one was around during the last movie. He kept telling me to take the drugs. It will help solve my problems." I began piecing it together. Then I remembered what Honda told me. "Is this about your family? From long ago?" He started writing again. "Yes." I bit my tongue. Through the pain, I asked him, "Was he starting to give those drugs to Anguirus?" He wrote down something else. This time, my eyes grew wide as I read what he wrote. "He is Anguirus." I gasped. I couldn't believe it. Our only hope to solve the problem was now a four-legged suit creature like Goji was. Then I realized that Anguirus' actor never told us his name. He just went by a nickname, Mr. A. Then I took the pencil and notepad and ran out of the cell. I closed the door and opened the window. "I'm going to find him," I told Goji. He nodded. Then I booked it down the hallway and ascended the winding staircase. I rushed past the writers in the writers department and went to go find Toshimitsu. I searched the studio for 10 minutes, maybe 15, bolting down every corridor and office I could see. I didn't care how crazy everyone thought I was. Screw the work, I thought. Screw the movies. This is important. I finally entered the soundstage where the incident had happened, and found Tanaka packing up the set for the day. He noticed me and began to look worried. "I need to find Toshimitsu. Do you know where he is?" I yelled breathlessly. Tanaka then looked puzzled. "He just left a few minutes ago. What's this all about?" I handed him the notepad. "Read this," I begged. Tanaka started to examine the scribbled notes, and then he eyed me inquisitively. "Have you been communicating with him?" he asked. He was referring to Goji. I nodded. "What does this mean?" he asked again. I then pulled him into a break room and began to tell him everything. The incident, the drugs, the dealer, who was now Anguirus. Tanaka ate this all up. I was expecting him to not believe me at all, but he looked very worried. "Toshimitsu went out of town on a trip, and I don't know where Anguirus is being kept, so I'm no help right now." My mind started to break it down. First Anguirus turns himself into the suit, and now Toshimitsu conveniently leaves town. I started to suspect that he was also in on it. So I told Tanaka about my thoughts, and his eyes grew wide. "Maybe he is. I'll call him right now. He might still be at home." He quickly went to a nearby office where he knew a phone was. I followed him. He dialed the number for Toshimitsu's place, and we heard it ring. After several seconds of no answer, Tanaka put down the phone. He must have left already. I was still determined to find him. "Let's go check his place to see if he left anything behind," Tanaka agreed. And he and I started walking out of the building. I thought we were working on a movie, but now we were on the run to sort out a man's mutated life. I hopped in Tanaka's car as we sped off from the studio. We drove for several minutes as we approached a small, isolated neighborhood just outside of the city in the Shiota district. Tanaka pulled into Toshimitsu Street as he searched for the house. "That's it right there. His car is still there." We pulled onto the opposite street so he wouldn't notice. We got out and snuck over to his house. It felt silly at first, but we just rolled with it. It was now evening, so we blended in pretty well. Tanaka went up to the door and found it was still unlocked, but he knocked on it anyway. "Toshimitsu, it's me, Tomoyuki. I just want to talk to you about your trip." Silence. "Hello?" Tanaka said. He kept knocking. No answer. He then gave me the signal to come up to the door. He turned the knob and shoved it open, and we walked slowly inside. All of the lights were off, and there was a stiffness in the air. We split up and searched the house. I went to the bedrooms and bathrooms while Tanaka went off in the small living room. Houses in Japan were much smaller than back in Oregon, so I knew it wouldn't take long to find him. As soon as I opened the door to the bedroom, I heard Tanaka call from across the house. "Alex, I found him." As soon as I heard that, I rushed over to the kitchen, where Tanaka was cornering Toshimitsu. Chapter 7. Under the dim light of the kitchen lamp, I knew it was him. He had a suitcase clutched in his arms, and he looked frightened. Tanaka stood over him, so he couldn't easily escape. Toshimitsu said, "Why are you two in my house? I should call the police on you. This is trespassing." Tanaka lifted him up on his feet and told him, "We don't mean any harm. We're just trying to figure out where Anguirus is." Toshimitsu now looked surprised. "He's gone? Well, where is he?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Tanaka explained. "It's just that Alex here thought it was a bit suspicious that you left the studio right as it happened. Plus, didn't you order the crew to take him off set?" Toshimitsu put his hand on his forehead and walked over to the kitchen counter for a glass of water. Before he took a sip, he said, "I thought they knew what I meant. When I told those men to take him away, I thought they meant take him to a cell. Preferably an empty one in the corridor where Goji is stored. I forgot that no one else but us producers and directors know where that cell is. I've really messed up, haven't I? Tanaka and I exchanged glances. Then I spoke up. It's alright, we'll find him eventually. But for now, we're sorry that we broke in. Toshimitsu smiled. It's quite alright. Besides, my train doesn't leave for another hour. I'm heading to a business conference in Osaka. The studio needed someone to discuss to their city hall that we were planning on using their town for location of the film. I'm just going for final confirmation. So, good day to you two. I must be leaving now. And with that, Toshimitsu grabbed his stuff and walked out the door. Tanaka and I walked back down to the car and headed back to the studio. We were glad to know that Toshimitsu wasn't involved in some conspiracy, but I was scared of what to tell Goji when we got there. Once we arrived, I went down into the basement to talk with Goji. Tanaka followed. He was far too interested in this conspiracy to walk away from it. He needed answers too. I opened the door and found Goji lying awkwardly on his bed. It was far too small for him, but he made it work anyway. As soon as I walked in, he lifted his head up and noticed me and Tanaka. I handed him back the notepad and pencil I still had on me. He wrote something down. Did you find him? And why is he here? I told him everything, and how we thought Toshimitsu was in on it, and how he had no idea where Anguirus was gone. Goji stared at the floor in shock, and then he did something we never saw him do before. He began to cry. It wasn't very noticeable, but I saw his head start shaking, like he was sobbing. Then tears started pouring down his rubbery face, which now looked much different than before we started filming Godzilla raids again. Tanaka and I squatted down around him and tried our best to comfort him. After a few moments, Tanaka spoke. I'm so sorry about all of this, but corporate still needs us to finish this movie. We'll have to write Anguirus out now that we lost him. Are you still up to film? Goji lifted his head and nodded. He may have been miserable with the fact that he now lived like this, but he was still dedicated to his role. So we left the cell and turned out the lights for the night. Tomorrow was a new day. The next morning we found our director Oda sitting at his desk. He immediately asked if we knew where Anguirus was. Tanaka and I told him about Toshimitsu and how he didn't know where the new suit beast was. Oda looked down at his desk and told us to leave, but more importantly, to go to the soundstage and begin filming. Throughout the rest of the shooting, Tanaka stayed close to my camera. He was the producer after all, but every day kept informing me if he heard anything about Anguirus, which he said, corporate is still searching the studio anonymously, making up rumors that there's a rat infestation somewhere. I laughed at that, for the weak excuse and for the irony of that statement. We continued filming the now revised section of the movie. Godzilla would still end up on the mountainous island, but this time he would be buried in an avalanche. We spent the next few weeks filming in the large soundstage, which was now a massive valley covered in fake snow. We shot clips of fighter jets on wires as they flew past the mountain, shooting missiles at Godzilla, or then crashing into the snow and creating an avalanche. We filmed as real ice, packed nicely, fell in a massive landslide on the Godzilla. Goji didn't mind this because the suit was pretty durable, and the hard ice didn't hurt him a bit. After we filmed the burial, we turned up the heat in the soundstage as all of the ice began to melt away. Goji brushed himself off as he ran over to Tanaka and I. We all high-fived each other as we celebrated our final shot. The next couple of weeks were spent either recording sound, music, or editing special effects before the movie was officially finished. The film premiered in April of 1955, and it was Oda's most successful film he had ever directed. Tanaka and I regularly visited the studio every day to hear if any executive producer wanted yet another sequel. But after a full month of nothing, we began to visit once a week, mainly to check in on Goji. Toho had gifted him with a shelf full of books, which we were afraid that he couldn't read with his new vision, but he read just fine. They even hired someone to teach him sign language, to help him communicate easier. Everyone else on set was taught it as well. I became an expert at that quickly, and soon dropped my job as a cameraman for a while at Toho to pursue other jobs around the city. I got into an accounting job at the Bank of Tokyo and met a nice woman there. We started dating for a while and eventually got married in summer of 1956. It was at this time that the first Godzilla film finally released in America. It wasn't really impressive though, as over 30 minutes of the movie was cut, and featured a character named Steve Martin, who was played by an American actor named Raymond Burr. Goji hated this movie, as they even changed the title of it, Godzilla, King of the Monsters. It sounded fitting for a monster movie, but the film itself lacked a strong story, compared to the Japanese original. I began to notice just how much of a pet peeve American culture was to Goji. I even got up the urge to tell him that I was born in America, and he didn't acknowledge me for a week. And, since she was my spouse, I ended up telling my wife about the man in the suit. She thought it was fascinating, and kinda scary, but she was a fan of the first two movies. She felt bad for me when I told her Goji started ignoring me for being part American. She assured me that he was just going through one of those stages, like a teenager. But eventually Goji started talking to me again. He no longer wrote on paper, and started speaking in the newly learned sign language that he was taught. "I'm sorry about last week," he told me one day. "I just don't like those Americans." I asked him why. "They're just annoying. All of their commercials and products, and how determined they are to become our friends." I looked at him reassuringly, and slightly agreed with him. At that time, it had been 11 years since World War II ended, and I knew deep down that Goji really hated the Americans because of the bombs they dropped on us. The bombs they dropped on them, his wife and daughter. We were also getting news that America had entered a rivalry with the Soviet Union shortly after the war ended. This rivalry turned into an arms race. Which country could make the most bombs and weaponry? The Japanese government hated this, and sought out to not make any nuclear weapons at all. Because even though the Americans used an atomic bomb on warfare in Japan, they didn't want to be responsible with that power. 5 more years went by and I rarely visited the studio. Tanaka was still producing movies, and he kept me posted on how Goji was doing. Sometimes they would bring him out to watch other films be made. He even sent me a photo of him chilling in the director's chair with a megaphone. I ended up framing this photo in my living room. I, on the other hand, was starting my stage of fatherhood. In 1957, we had our first child, a girl. We named her Sakura, after the famous cherry blossoms of Japan. She was quite a handful as a toddler, but she was now 4 and became a pretty generous child, considering how young she still was. All of this parenting made me forget about Toho Studios. That is, until I got an important phone call. It was January of 1962. Tokyo was starting to build up in technology and economy. Trains were slowly getting faster, more goods were exported across the Pacific, and everywhere you walked looked colorful. One winter morning I received a call from someone I hadn't spoken to in a few years. It was Ishiro Honda. Whatever he was working on was important, as he directly called my home number. "Hey Alex, it's been a while. How's the wife?" Tanaka must have told him. I cleared my throat and answered, "Yeah, hey, she's doing great. We have a beautiful daughter who's learning to become a lady." Honda chuckled. "It's good to hear." There was a pause in his speech. "Alex, they're making another movie. And this time, he's fighting a foreigner." I was stumped for a second, and then realized what he meant. "I'll be right there," I said. I didn't even wait to hear what Honda said before I slammed the phone down and ran out the door. I arrived at Toho Studios. Their main building looked bigger than when I saw it last, and several new buildings were added to it. I walked into the lobby, which we never had, and kindly asked a receptionist where Honda's office was. "You must be Alex," she said. "He's upstairs on the 2nd floor, writer's department. You shouldn't miss it." I thanked her and walked up the shiny stairs to the writer's corridor. Everything looked nice and clean. I thought I was in the future. I walked up to Honda's office that had a proper bronze plaque over the doorframe with his name on it. I stepped in. The office had large windows with a gorgeous view of the city. Over the last few years, the buildings in downtown Tokyo had grown taller, but I still saw that lovely view of Mount Fuji in the background. "Yeah, I know what you're thinking," a familiar voice said. "Do I ever get bored of that view?" "No, I absolutely don't." "Good to see you, Alex," he said as he got up from his desk and gave me a hug. I patted him on the back. "The studio looks great. What have I been missing?" I asked. "A whole lot. The studio is really making a name for itself. Come on and sit down. I'll fix you a cup of tea." Honda walked over to a proper stove and began to boil some tea in a shiny new kettle. I sat down by his desk as he proceeded to hand me a fresh cup. I took a small sip of it before I spoke. "So, they're deciding to make another movie about him, huh?" Honda looked back at me as he sat down at his desk. "Yes, they have. We've entered a new era of movies, Alex. They're starting to ask for more." He took a swig of his tea. I then sat up straight in my chair. "So, who's this foreigner they want him to fight?" I asked. "From the way you said it, it almost sounds like he's fighting a tourist." I laughed. Honda didn't, though, and instead looked down at his cup. He spoke in a serious tone, like one of a boss during the meetings I had as an accountant. "Toho is teaming up with another big-name studio. One that has produced a lot of iconic monsters. Frankenstein, Dracula, the Invisible Man, why, even Abbott and Costello. But there's one in particular that meets the appropriate height of Godzilla." I leaned closer to Honda, while I started drowning in suspense. "Well, who is it?" I asked. Honda looked back up at me. "We've joined forces with Universal Pictures, and Godzilla will now be fighting King Kong." I dropped my cup as it shattered on the floor. Chapter 8. I sat there for seconds in shock. Then I choked out, "Kong? He's fighting King Kong?" Honda nodded his head, and then walked over to the large windows of his office. He drew down the blinds and the room went dark. His eyes darted to me, and his face tightened. "Tanaka told me everything, about the drugs, about the disappearance of Anguirus, even Goji's hatred toward the Americans. I even tried to tell the company that this was a bad idea, but they had already signed an agreement for RKO Pictures to use the character. They even forced me to direct the movie since Oda wanted a break. I was hopeless. Now we can't take no for an answer. That's why I called you, so you could reassure Goji to not get angry at the actor for Kong. Now, are you in or not?" I scratched my head, which now felt like something was trying to tear my scalp off. I started thinking through the outcomes. If I said no to this movie, what would Goji do? Would he refuse to shoot the film, causing the company to lose millions of dollars? What if I said yes? Then Goji starts fighting the actor for real on set, to get his anger out? I was cursing myself for every second I spent thinking about my answer. Then, I hesitantly answered, "I'll do it. Anything for the sake of this." Honda nodded, but still didn't cheer up. "This is going to be yet another long production, Alex, and we don't know what Goji's going to do this time. But hey, let's just hope he doesn't lose his cool, alright?" I nodded. That made Honda cheer up. "Sounds good. We'll begin filming next week. Hope to see you there." I lifted my head up confidently, now holding back my regrets. Then I walked out of the office. The whole drive home I kept wondering about what I had just gotten myself into, if this would all be worth it, if it was the right choice. That night I told my wife that I was returning to Toho to be a cameraman, and she was overjoyed. Getting paid to shoot a movie was better than getting paid to count taxes all day. So she had no problem with me going back. Working cameras also helped us pay for childcare to support Sakura, who was nearly 5 at the time. Knowing this actually made me sleep that night, but I found myself in a nightmare. In it, I was alone in a dark place. I couldn't see, but I knew what was around me. Concrete walls. But I also wasn't alone. I heard noises behind me. Footsteps. Loud and heavy footsteps. I pulled out a camera and decided to use it as a flat. I pulled out a camera and decided to use its flash to see who it was. My finger was locked to the button as I began to snap a photo, but I wish I never pushed it. A bright flash lit up the hallway as I saw something sinister at the end of it. It smiled, not like a human, but like a demon. I started breathing heavily as we stared each other down. Then it began to sprint at me, making a horrible shrieking noise as it charged towards me. Before it reached me, I jolted out of my bed in a cold sweat. It was 4 in the morning, and my wife didn't notice that I had woken up, so I lied back down and tried my best to fall asleep. In my mind I saw that face, that unforgiven face. There was something vaguely familiar in it, but I couldn't think of what it was. Finally, I passed back out. Next week I arrived at the studio, and was directed to a soundstage larger than anything I had seen previously. This soundstage was now a large concrete building that looked now the size of a soccer stadium. I walked inside to find several massive sets had been constructed. There was a large mountain hillside with a town set separated from it, and what looked like an island set on the other side of the building. Everything looked amazing and colorful. I was informed that this would be the first Godzilla film to be shot in color. I later learned that Toho had previously produced 3 monster movies. One about a giant pterodactyl, one of a giant moth, and a large reptilian monster named Varan. Rodan was Toho's first movie in full color, and this one we were about to start filming was their 4th. Today's introduction to the movie was much different than previously. Toshimitsu returned on set and immediately showed us what Kong would look like for the movie. He was ugly, and was a typical brown color like an orangutan. His face had bugged out eyes and a chubby face. His hands and feet were a dark gray color, like they were dipped in tar, and had a shaved peachy colored chest. The suit was very bulky, which made him look like a wrestler. I felt less stressed about how I thought Goji's reaction would be to this ugly gorilla. I assumed that he would laugh about it, but I was wrong. They brought Goji out on set and immediately glared at the Kong suit. His eyes studied it up and down. Then he turned to me and signed, "I'm fighting an American monkey? Why do I have to fight this ugly gorilla? Couldn't I have fought something else?" I put my hand on his shoulder and stared at him in the eyes. "Look at me, Goji. Look in my eyes. He won't be played by an American." Goji still glared at me, and then relaxed, and signed again. Good, because I would have kicked his bare butt if it was. Tanaka was also in the vicinity of our conversation, and noticed Goji's sign. He snickered at that. As he did, Honda walked on set, chatting up a new face. He noticed us and smiled. "Alex, Tanaka, Goji, this is Shoichi Hirose. He will be playing the role of King Kong." Hirose bowed his head. "Even Goji, pleasure to meet you all. And who's the guy in the suit?" he asked. Our smiles faded. I glared at Tanaka, who glared at Honda, who glared back at me. A triangle of glares as we thought of what to say next. Honda broke the silence. "He's just Goji. We don't acknowledge his real name." Hirose was confused. "Why so?" Honda pulled him aside, and we knew what he was saying to him. I noticed Hirose had a shocked look on his face, but then tried to smile again. Honda walked back over to us, and Hirose shook Goji's hand. "Can't wait to start filming with you, Goji." Hirose was then given a glare by Goji, but it wasn't one out of anger, but one of a sly fox ready to attack its prey. Hirose was as innocent as a rabbit, and was soft like one too. I began to rethink my decision that Goji really hated Hirose for portraying an American character, but I kept telling myself that there was no turning back now. The first few weeks of production were interesting. We filmed scenes where Godzilla and Kong were separate, not getting in each other's presence once during that. Kong's scenes were first shot on the island set, where he fought a giant squid, in which Kong turned into calamari. The character, not the actor inside. Godzilla scenes were first shot at the smaller soundstage with the pool. It was still larger than previous sound stages and had another replica of the Osaka castle. It really just had a different castle on the base of Mount Fuji, by the bay. I was informed that was where the final battle would take place. But first we continued from the last movie, where an American submarine accidentally ran into a large glacier that Godzilla was still trapped in from Godzilla Raids Again. Subaraya, still on special effects, drove the tiny submarine prop into the ice, and then after several fake explosions, Goji broke out of his frozen prison. He immediately destroyed the submarine. It was in the script, but he still got his anger out from it being an American sub. We later moved on to the military strategy of killing Godzilla. Something about them trapping him into a pit and shooting him repeatedly. We were still on the same soundstage, but now had a large open area with a massive hill to the side. On top of it were several missile launchers aiming down at the pit, which would explode to create the crater. Goji began walking dramatically towards the invisible pit. My camera was next to it, showing the dramatic irony as he kept walking closer. Finally, I backed up my camera as the floor collapsed beneath Godzilla. Another camera was inside the pit and watched as Godzilla fell in. We cut the cameras and moved on to several shots of turrets and tanks firing everything into the pit. After some time of waiting, Godzilla emerged, and then pantomimed his atomic breath as every single vehicle exploded and burst into flames. He did a victory roar, and continued walking. That scene was now done. During that shooting, Kong's scenes were finished, and we now moved on to the first scene where the two would fight. We brought Goji into the large soundstage, and he noticed Kong. Hirose was in the suit, but Goji forgot about that. We positioned them for the start of the filming, and as soon as the camera started rolling, Goji drop-kicked Kong as he toppled over with a thud. Goji let out an excited roar as Kong struggled to get back up. The dropkick wasn't in the script, and we were worried, but Honda ordered us that they kept rolling the film. Kong was now back up and he charged towards Godzilla. He grabbed him by the head as Goji struggled. Then the two started shoving each other back and forth, tripping over small buildings as the fight went on. At one point, Goji swung his tail around as Kong jumped over it. Then he swung his tail again, this time tripping him over. Goji then went to stomp on him, but Kong sprang back up and grabbed the tail. Goji was strapped to wires for this part as Kong swung him around in a circle. Then on the third spin let go as Goji went flying off the screen. We cut the cameras and moved to a building as Goji landed right into it. We cut the cameras. As we were getting ready for the next stage of the fight, Hirose got out of his suit and walked over to Goji. He looked angry. "Do you have a problem or something?" he said to him. "What was the dropkick for? I thought you were just going to shove me lightly." Goji looked over at me and signed. I read what he said and repeated it to Hirose. "He likes to go off script sometimes and add more action to the fight. He says he's sorry, and that you should keep that in mind every time we shoot." Hirose looked at Goji, then smiled. "I'm sorry about that. I guess I wasn't ready for that. I'll look out for the next time." He patted Goji on the back and walked back over to the suit. Goji kept watching him the whole time. We continued the battle, ending off with Kong being flown into another building. Godzilla celebrated and continued his rampage throughout the city. We were now done with the first fight. "Next week we will spend 2 days shooting the final battle," Honda said, as then he pointed to the large mountain set. "We will all meet over here at the Mount Fuji set." I marveled at it. The set was enormous, and had a realistic canvas background of the sky, with the rest of the mountain in the background. I spent that night imagining the excitement I would witness of the final brawl, but at the same time, I remembered the dropkick that Goji improvised earlier that day. How it looked pretty purposeful, and it was because he wanted it in the cut. But there was something about how abrupt it was, how it was too perfect of a move. The actors were always told to throw their punches lightly, meaning that they had to make it look like it was painful, when it never was. Goji broke that rule today, and covered up what I knew what he was doing, getting payback at Hirose. But why? I thought. Goji said he was okay with Hiros, right? My mind wandered. Deep in my thoughts, I tried to read Goji's mind. Read what he thought deep inside that skin. Then it occurred to me that he was doing this because he thought Hiros had betrayed Goji by now joining the Americans as Kong. And I tried my best not to let that thought win over. But it did. After maybe a few hours of thinking this, I've drifted off to sleep again. And suddenly, I returned to my nightmare of the concrete walls, the darkness, the sounds of the footsteps. I tried my hardest not to pull out the camera, to see that horrible face down the hall, that inhuman smile. My dream won the fight as my camera flashed, and the face charged at me. I once again jolted out of bed in a cold sweat. This time, I decided to leave the bed. I walked through the dark house to get a drink of water to calm myself down, but the darkness was closing in. I began to pick up my pace as I threw open the fridge to grab the pitcher of water. As soon as I emptied my cup, I ran back through the house and hopped into the bed with my wife, who was still asleep. I buried my head under the covers, certain I just heard a loud stomp. The next day, however, I forgot about the dream and started sleeping peacefully the rest of that week. It was now March, and Japan was beautiful. I spent the next week taking time to myself, taking my daughter to the park, and enjoying the spring air. I still thought about the filming we were going to do, and as the days flew by, as the day finally came for shooting, I got a phone call the day before from Toho asking if I could bring a small camera to take behind-the-scenes photos for their records. I agreed and took my 16mm camera I kept from my childhood in Oregon. I arrived at the studio early and began to set up my camera in advance. Once I was finished, Tanaka walked in on the set and looked surprised. "Early bird gets the worm, I guess," is all he had to say. About half an hour later, the rest of the crew showed up. Honda sat in his directing chair. Hiros climbed into his suit, and Goji was doing his stretches. Everyone else got into their respective positions. Before we began filming, I took a few snapshots of the set and the characters in their starting positions. They were both at the top of the set, about 10 meters up in the set. Kong was strapped to wires as fake balloons were attached to him. I thought this looked really stupid, but Honda assured me that this film was much more kid-friendly than the last two, so it had to look sort of silly. The cables lifted Kong in the air as he hung limp on the balloons. Godzilla was supposed to be hit by the falling Kong as the balloons popped. Honda yelled "action" and the balloons burst as Kong began his descent. Goji looked up as he was pounced on by the falling gorilla, and together the two began to roll down the hill. When they stopped, Godzilla sprang up and began to throw fake punches at Kong. The fight was on. Kong ran from Godzilla and hid behind an area on the set where it looked like a crater. Godzilla lost sight of Kong, but his tail was snatched by him. Kong was thrown down as he got back up and started throwing foam rocks at Godzilla, but he retaliated, spraying Kong with his atomic breath as they kept running on the set. They danced around for several more minutes as they rolled around on the ground of the mountain set. At one point, Kong tried to dive towards Godzilla, but slammed his head on some rocks. This was in the script. Godzilla swung some rocks on him. There would be a brief moment of Kong lying unconscious on the ground before he got back up and started fighting. But he was drop-kicked by Godzilla as Kong went down again. This was now added in the script. Goji started throwing boulders at him and smacking Kong with his tail, and then he pantomimed his atomic breath and surrounded an unconscious Kong with fire. At this point, we cut the cameras for a break. 20 minutes later, we were back in action. Kong was still down as we lit the set back up in flames. In later effects, a storm would roll in, and Kong would be struck by lightning. He then rose back up with some electrical superpowers, and shocked Godzilla as they continued to topple down the set. We cut the cameras, and I snapped a few more photos. So far so good, I thought. Everyone began to pack things up as we moved on to the next set, the castle by the pool. As I was putting my camera back in my case, Honda approached me. He gave me a very friendly look and said, Walk and talk with me, Alex. I picked up my camera case and started walking with him. So, I know that you're getting the whole filming experience, and I trust your skills as a cameraman. I was flattered. No one ever complimented my skills before. I wasn't even credited in both movies because I thought my role in the production was far too small. I kept listening to Honda's speech. I need a favor from you. We need to get this movie done quickly, and I have a meeting with the board of directors at 2 o'clock. Could you be in charge of this next scene for me while I'm there? I stopped in my tracks and was speechless. You mean direct the scene? I stuttered. Honda nodded and then said, I know it sounds like a lot of work, but I trust you. You'll do great. He gave me a pat on the back. Good luck, he said, and handed me his script. As he walked away, I studied it. The next scene was simple, so I got Hiroshi and Goji along with 3 crew members to follow me to the other soundstage. Hiroshi was still in costume, and Goji walked parallel to him and stuck close to me. We rounded out the back door to the opposite building and walked inside. The soundstage was dark, so one of the stagehands turned on the lights. The set was surreal. Everything in that room was the scenery of the sky, the ground of the set, and the water below. I set up my camera, and then started reading through the script again. I told Goji and Hiroshi where to stand and what position they had to start in. In this scene, all they had to do was this. Kong would retreat behind a castle as Godzilla chased him down. Kong would keep ducking his head out to taunt Godzilla as he kept smashing the castle. Then Kong would do a double take and run away from the castle back towards the mountain. Godzilla would then try to hit him with his atomic blast, and then the scene would cut. Later we would finish the scripted fight in a small town by the mountain. I began to tell the 2 actors what to do, and the crew members got in their places to signal to fire from the atomic blast, or to blow dust in the castle to show destruction rather than the fake set crash down with no rubble. The 2 actors got into their places to start the fight, and that's where I caught a glimpse on Goji's face. I saw it for a split second before it went away, but the expression on him looked rather sinister, like a spider before a kill. I didn't think much of it in that moment, so I just carried on. I yelled, "Action!" and started rolling. Kong ran down to the castle and ducked behind it. Godzilla came running in and started punching it. The building began to shake, as Kong kept tauntingly ducking his head out to trigger Godzilla. This happened a few more times before Kong did his double take and ran. But as he started running, I saw another look on Goji's face. It was that same expression from earlier. I first thought it was part of his character in the scene, being angry at Kong for taunting him. But suddenly, he did a move that reminded me that it wasn't an act at all. Goji smashed through the castle prop to cut off Kong's path and tackled him. They were too close to the cliff. The 2 beasts then slowly tumbled into the pool below. My camera was locked on them the whole time as they came splashing down. This was not in the script. The 3 crew members immediately left their positions as they ran up to the cliff. There was a moment of stillness, no movement in the water. I asked for the crew to jump in and find him, but they all refused. They were too scared to jump in the water. I began walking over to the pool, and we finally saw movement in the water. Bubbles began to breach the surface, as only one of the monsters rose out of the water. It was Goji. Hiroshi was nowhere to be seen. I stood there frozen, before Goji locked eyes with me. The crew members had already took off running. They had left the set completely. I took off running, and as I did, the power went out. Goji must have cut it. I had no idea where I was, so I started running in random directions. This all looked too familiar. I kept slamming into concrete walls as I desperately tried to find an exit. I stopped in place and began to think about where I was going to go, how I could possibly see where I was going. I realized that I still had my camera on me, and I could use the flash of it to see where it was. That's when I heard something. Loud, heavy, and very steady footsteps. This was unnervingly way too familiar. I pulled out the camera, and pointed it in the direction of the noises. My finger was frozen on the button, forbidding me to press it. My intrusive thoughts won, as the corridor in front of me lit up in a blinding flash. And then I saw him, the man in the suit, Goji, standing several yards away from me on the other side of the long hallway. He stood completely still, with an unforgiving smile on his face. This was not the Goji I knew and loved. He seemed to lose all innocence, instead showing me what his true dark side was. A hell-bent demon in the form of a reptilian suit monster. At that moment I realized he meant to go off script, killing Hiros because he betrayed him, playing an American character. I only saw him for a split second before the darkness pressed closer to me. I was frozen in shock, paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move. I refused to move. Then I heard the sound of a high-pitched shriek. Followed by more footsteps, this time at a faster pace. My nightmare had come true, and now Goji was chasing me down. I came back to reality and started running. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me. My heart was pounding against my chest, begging me to stop, but I ignored it. I started slamming into concrete walls as I navigated through the pitch-black maze, running anywhere but towards the footsteps. My limbs hurt from running into every single wall, but the rush of adrenaline kept me going. I heard that shriek again. Much closer this time. It was almost right behind me. I refused to turn around. I rounded one last corner, running painfully into a wall, as I saw daylight beaming from underneath a door. I was almost there. Freedom. But now I felt hot air on the back of my neck. I forced my legs to pump harder, faster, as I slammed into the door. I swung around it before slamming it shut and locking it behind me. A second later, something slammed into the door. I knew it was Goji trying to break it down, but I stood there and panted. My heart was still racing, but I was now in open light at the back of the studio. I took a second to pull myself together as the slamming on the door stopped. The only sounds I could now hear were the birds chirping in the spring air and the cars driving past the studio. They didn't take my mind off the near-death experience that I just witnessed. After a few minutes of just standing there and staring at the door, I took off running towards the main building to find Honda, Tanaka, anyone that could tell what just happened. I burst inside and frantically asked the receptionist where the board of directors meeting was. "On the third floor to the left. Do you have clearance?" she asked. "All I have is a message," I said, and immediately stormed up the stairs. I rounded the corner on the third floor and took a sharp left towards the meeting rooms. 2 security guards stood outside the room and blocked me from rushing inside. "You can't come in," one said. "There's an important meeting going on." "I know that," I said, as I struggled to pass them. "I need to speak with Honda. There's been an incident in Soundstage 4. The guards stared at me and confused. "What kind of incident?" one said. I didn't have time to explain. "Just bring Honda out here now." The guards looked at each other. Then the one on the right peeked his head in the meeting. The guards looked at each other. Then the one on the right peeked his head in. The meeting went quiet. "There's someone outside who needs to speak with Ishiro." I peeked through the blinds as I saw Honda get up from his chair and walk towards the door. The meeting continued. He slowly closed the door behind him. He looked annoyed. "What are you doing up here?" he whispered. "You're supposed to be in the soundstage filming. Can't you see that I'm in a meeting?" I grabbed Honda by the shoulders and gripped him hard. He stopped talking. I looked at him seriously as he stared back in shock. The security guards just stood back and listened. I spoke with Honda. "There's been another incident," I softly whispered in a shaky breath. I was now on the verge of tears, right in front of the director. Honda's eyes went wide as he heard those words. He slowly backed away. "What happened this time?" he said hesitantly. I looked at the security guards, then back at Honda. "We can't talk here," I said. The security guards nodded, as I pulled Honda into an empty office. I closed the door behind us and pulled down the blinds so no one could look in. Honda sat at a desk with his head in his hand. Without looking at me, he asked, "Did Hiroshi get trapped in a suit?" I sat down in a chair and stared at the nearly broken director. I was now at a breaking point. Before I could choke out a single word, I broke down into tears. This was the first time since 1954 that I could let myself cry. Every time we filmed a Godzilla film, something bad would have happened. First Goji, then Anguirus, and now Hiroshi. My head was now buried in my hands as I sobbed uncontrollably. I felt Honda's hand pat me on the shoulder. He would always do that as a friendly pat to say, "We've got this." Now, it was my only source of comfort. Through my sobs, I heard Honda say, "It was worse than that, wasn't it?" I started to speak, but could only say a few words at a time. "It was worse," I sputtered out. I cried for several minutes before I began to pull myself together. With my eyes now watery from tears and my throat dry, I began to tell Honda my story. We were filming the final battle in the soundstage. There were 6 of us, me, 3 crew members, Goji, and Hiroshi. I followed the script. I told everyone what to do. I couldn't think of anything that could possibly go wrong. Honda smiled. "I knew you were a director at heart," he proudly said, but he continued to listen. We started filming, and the first half of this shot went okay. Kong ran to the castle, kept taunting Goji, before he started to run away. That's when things went off script. My eyes began to water again. Goji broke through the castle set and tackled Hiroshi right off the cliff of the set. I filmed the whole thing. That's when it occurred to me that my film camera was still set up in the soundstage, to where I hoped to God that Goji was still trapped inside. I shook that off and continued. We hesitated to jump in and find them both. As we did, I stopped and started hyperventilating. Honda began to sit up in his chair. "What happened? As you hesitated, what happened next?" Honda spoke in his authoritative director's voice. I was now screaming. "Goji was the only one who came out," I yelled, and broke down in tears again. Through my blurry vision from tears, I saw Honda's expressive horror on his face. He turned away and clamped his hand over his mouth in disbelief. He turned back to me. "You mean Hiroshi is dead?" Honda said in his normal voice. "Yes!" I screamed again. Honda was now panicking. "You mean you left him in the building?" Honda screamed. I still sobbed. "Damn it, Alex, talk to me! Is he still inside the soundstage?" Honda was now crouched beside me. As I continued to cry, I still said nothing. That's when Honda slapped me across the face. I stopped sobbing, and was now in full control again. Without Honda saying a word, I stared him dead in the eyes. "Goji is still in the building," I whispered. And with that, Honda stormed out of the room. I ran out to catch up with him. He was speed-walking to not draw attention. "How long has he been locked in?" Honda said as we walked. "I'm not sure," I said. "Maybe 10, 15 minutes?" Honda kept looking forward. "We need every crew member available from this movie to surround that building. We need to get him back into his cell." Honda was now back in his director's attitude, but this time he sounded more like a police chief than a filming director. I glared at him, but knew that this was the right idea. We had to get Goji back in his cell to calm him down. As we walked out of the lobby, we began to start running towards the main soundstage. We barged in as Honda picked up a megaphone. "Attention all stagehands," he boomed. "Something bad has happened in Soundstage 4. We need every available hand to surround that building. Block all of the exits. We cannot let Goji escape the building. Do I make myself clear?" Everyone inside was still. They glanced at one another, as they were processing Honda's words. Suddenly, every single person inside started walking towards the main door. They gathered around me and Honda. He put down his megaphone. Alright, there are 6, 12, 18, 24 of you all. There are 3 exits at the soundstage, which means I need 8 of you per door. Now, follow me. We started marching to the shut down building. It stood firm as we knew that a beast was still locked inside. The crew members quickly broke themselves up into 8 groups and in seemingly orderly fashion. The 3 crowds began to rush over to any door they could see to the building. Honda and I followed the group to the back door that I had ran out of earlier. It was at this time that I finally noticed that my camera was still on me. So I took this time to show Honda the haunting photo I took of that dark hallway. As I was running away from him, I took this. I rolled out the film and showed it to Honda, but I refused to look at the picture. Honda studied the photo as he tried to make out exactly what I saw. He pointed to something in the dark picture. I finally looked. "Is that Goji?" Honda asked. He pointed to a white spot in the back of the illuminated corridor. It took me a few seconds to make out the spot. It was 2 bright balls of light with tiny circles in them, and 2 rows of sharp teeth curled into a smile. And that was all you saw in the back. No figure, no head, just that uncanny face. I turned to Honda and nodded. He immediately shoved the film back into the camera. He turned his head to the door as he began to slowly walk towards it. The 8 crew members stood in a semicircle around the door, shoulder to shoulder, the arms locked together. Honda was now at the door as he attempted to open it, but before he unlocked it, he paused. He then took a step back and continued to stare at the locked door. He leaned his head back. "What are the odds that he's still standing at the door?" he said. I noticed that he was asking me this, but I just stood there confused. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "I mean, I'm looking at this door, and my mind tells me that he's gone. But my instincts are telling me that there is something standing on the other side of this door. And I think it knows that I know as well." I ate up his words, and then started to get that feeling too. It felt like we were all being watched. Honda took another step back and started thinking. He turned towards the arc of men as they still stood in place. He looked at 2 of them. "I need you 2. Come here," he said, and the circle shrank. They approached him as he gave them the plan. "Okay, I need one of you to grip the handle, and only when I say so do you swing that door open as fast as you can. Then I need the other guy to help me and Alex grab Goji." They both nodded as one of them walked up to the door. He stopped, and we all knew why. He began to get that same feeling, like he was being watched. Honda, the other man, and I stood just 3 feet from the door. We stood in a formation. I was to the left, the crew member was to the right, and Honda was right in the middle. We figured if Goji tried to escape, that we block every path of him escaping. The man at the door gripped the door handle as he was starting to sweat. His gaze was fixed on Honda as he quietly started counting down. 3, 2, 1! Door swung open as we charged in. Just as we suspected, Goji stood facing the door with that smile still glued to his face. We sprang onto him as Honda grabbed his left arm and I grabbed his right. He didn't struggle at all. He just let it all happen. The 3rd guy walked up behind his dorsal plates as we began to escort him back into the studio. We walked through the back door to where the basement still was. We descended down a narrow winding staircase. I thought we were going to fall, but we got down to the cell block. Tanaka was waiting there. He had heard the news from one of the crew members as he was also rushed out of the meeting, which I forgot he was in. Without saying a word, he opened the cell door as we dragged Goji inside. He was now frowning and looked upset. He stood in the middle of the dark room as his eyes met mine. They grew wide as I began to shut the door. It slammed shut, and all was silent in the dark hallway.